Planes, ships, and souls have vanished there without a trace, and the Bermuda Triangle continues to haunt imaginations more than 200 years after the first recorded disappearance. So what's really going on in the Devil's Triangle? One of the earliest known disappearances in the Bermuda Triangle happened in August 1800 when the 105-man crew of the USS Pickering vanished into the Atlantic. On August 20th, the Pickering set sail from Newcastle, Delaware to the Caribbean island of Guadeloupe, where Commodore Thomas Truxtun was set to take over command. But no one ever saw the Pickering again. There was no wreckage or any other sign of the ship. It simply disappeared. That October, Truxtun wrote to the Secretary of the Navy with the news, concluding that the Pickering had been lost in a gale that September, but no trace of the ship has ever been found, and the image of over 100 unsuspecting crewmen sailing off into oblivion remains haunting. Here's the one that really started it all. On the afternoon of December 5, 1945, Flight 19, consisting of 5 Avenger bombers and 14 aviators, took off from the Naval Air Station at Fort Lauderdale, Florida. They were to conduct a bombing exercise, fly over the Bahamas, and return home.
It was a routine training flight. All of the pilots had several hundred hours in various types of planes.
To add to that, the group's commander, Lieutenant Charles C. Taylor, was a seasoned pilot who'd flown numerous missions during World War II. But as they turned north toward Grand Bahama Island, the group got lost. Then a storm rolled in, making navigation even more confusing. A nearby Navy officer, Lieutenant Robert F. Cox, heard Flight 19's radio call. Lieutenant Taylor said his compasses were malfunctioning, and he was certain the group had flown far off course, closer to the Florida Keys.
At the same time, would be a very rare occurrence.
The squadron was advised to fly west toward the setting sun, but Taylor, perhaps thinking he was over the Gulf of Mexico, directed the group to fly east, then turn west. Eventually, they lost radio contact.
We couldn't believe it. How could 5 of our qualified pilots be missing all at one time?
In Flight 19's last known radio transmission, the communication pretty much summed up the situation. No one's exactly sure who said it, but it's recorded as being, "It looks like we are entering white water. We're completely lost." No evidence of the missing squadron was recovered. It's likely that they ran out of fuel and crashed into the ocean, but the unresolved fate of Flight 19 remains one of the most famous mysteries of the Bermuda Triangle. Great Isaac Key in the Bahamas is a tiny island that, since 1850, has been home to the Great Isaac Lighthouse. Today, the lighthouse is automated, but back in the 1960s, it was still operated by lighthouse keepers. On August 4, 1969, a supply team arrived at the lighthouse to discover that the keepers had vanished without a trace, leaving everything in order. One theory was that Hurricane Anna, which had passed through the area days earlier, swept the unfortunate keepers away in a massive wave. Drugs and arms trafficking had been reported in the area, so another theory was that the keepers had been involved and somehow met a grisly end. Or maybe they sailed off to get ahead of the law, or the criminal element. And again, perhaps they were victims of paranormal activity. Lighthouse ghosts are a thing, and there were rumors about the ghost of a drowned 19th century woman wandering about the place. Whatever really happened, there's been no evidence of the missing lighthouse keepers or their fate to this day. In March 1918, the USS Cyclops was one of the largest ships in the US Navy, carrying a crew of 306. Originally built to carry bulk shipments of coal, on its final voyage, the Cyclops was loaded down with 11,000 tons of manganese, vital to the US steel industry and war effort. The Cyclops picked up the ore in Brazil and then stopped in Barbados because sailors had noticed that the water level on the heavily loaded ship was too high. The Cyclops stocked up with fuel and supplies for the final push and left Barbados on March 4th. They were due in Baltimore on March 13th, but never arrived. Their last known communication was that the weather looked fine and everything was going as expected.
The ship was last seen by a British patrol off of Barbados in perfect condition, just hours before it disappeared.
So what happened? Maybe a storm sunk the overloaded ship, or previous loads of coal had corroded the ship's structure. There's even some thought that the crew mutinied. All we know for sure is that the Cyclops never arrived in Baltimore, and no trace of it or its cargo has ever been found. For the 29 passengers on the December 28, 1948 flight between San Juan, Puerto Rico and Miami, Florida, it seemed like a normal trip. But somewhere over the Atlantic, the chartered Douglas DST airliner, often referred to as Airborne Transport DC-3, went missing. According to a 1949 accident report issued by the Civil Aeronautics Board, Captain Robert Lindquist and his crew experienced trouble even before takeoff, including a malfunctioning warning light and low batteries. Lindquist also noted issues with radio communications. He could receive but not transmit messages. Lindquist took off anyway, believing the plane's generators would recharge the batteries mid-flight, and that would solve the transmitter issue. At first, it looked like he was right. Lindquist radioed that he was 50 miles from Miami, but the transmission was received in New Orleans. Maybe Lindquist was so far off course because he hadn't received reports of wind changes that could dramatically affect navigation. We'll never know, because the plane never arrived anywhere. Despite a search that extended into the Gulf of Mexico, no wreckage was ever found, and no one was able to conclusively determine what happened to the airliner, its crew, or the 29 lost passengers. The Star Tiger and Star Ariel were British passenger liners that disappeared in January 1948 and January 1949, respectively. They were flying routes that took them from London to Bermuda, while the Star Ariel was also bound for Kingston, Jamaica. Both disappeared mid-flight with little warning. The Star Tiger carried 25 passengers and 6 crew members, while the Star Ariel had 20 aboard.
Was this converted bomber fit to carry passengers? Or were Avro Tudors fatally flawed?
In a 1948 accident report, the British Ministry of Civil Aviation noted that the Star Tiger had had numerous issues, including a faulty cabin heater and one malfunctioning compass. Captain Brian W. McMillan elected to fly at a dramatically low altitude, possibly to alleviate the heater issue. He appears to have overloaded the craft with fuel and passengers, which meant the Star Tiger would have burned fuel much faster. And as close as they were to the water, if there was an emergency, the plane would likely hit the ocean's surface in mere seconds. Just a year later, the Star Ariel disappeared in a much higher altitude of about 18,000 feet.
She was in good mechanical condition. She had an experienced pilot, an experienced crew, and the weather was fine.
An investigation ruled out fuel issues, weather, and pilot error, but former BSAA pilots told the BBC that the cabin heater and hydraulic systems were in close proximity. Leaking hydraulic fluid or fumes could have come into contact with the heater and caused a sudden explosion. And again, it's just a theory. The Revonoc, which disappeared on January 2, 1958, was a 43-foot racing yawl with a crew of 5. That means it's a sailboat with 2 masts in the family of yachts. The crew included experienced sailors like owner Harvey Conover. The ship's name was actually Conover spelled backwards.
Harvey Conover Sr. was one of the most trophied yachtsmen in the world.
Conover, his wife, their adult son Larry and his wife Mary, and friend William Flugelman all set out from Key West. Their apparent goal was to dock in Miami, though others suggested that they were actually trying to make it to Nassau, in the Bahamas. Wherever they were headed, something went terribly wrong. By the afternoon of Thursday, January 2nd, weather stations were warning of a gale with winds exceeding 50 miles per hour. Later, gusts of more than 70 miles per hour were recorded around Miami. Meanwhile, the Revonoc failed to appear as expected.
They had a receiver, but not a transmitter.
He couldn't radio anyone when they got into trouble.
No.
After a 2-day search, the ship's dinghy was found about 80 miles north of Miami, half sunk and with no sign of the crew. A passing shrimp boat reported seeing 5 people trailing from ropes behind a foundering craft, but immense waves, strong winds, and a malfunctioning motor meant they couldn't attempt to rescue. This was likely the last known sighting of the doomed ship and its crew. By 1965, the Yankee route was a popular flight path across the Atlantic just south of Florida. Yet while many aircraft have traveled through the region without incident, that wasn't the case for the Fairchild C-119 flying boxcar piloted by Major Louis Giuntoli on June 5th of that year. Giuntoli, along with 9 other members of the 440th Airlift Wing, was set to arrive at Grand Turk Island in the Bahamas that evening. It was a fairly boring trip, just dropping off an engine and maintenance crew in Grand Turk, hopping over to Puerto Rico to pick up a load of concertina wire, then dropping that off at a base in the Dominican Republic. Yet, after a routine communication, the C-119 seemingly flew into oblivion. When it didn't arrive at Grand Turk, a massive search kicked off. Searchers did find part of the missing airplane, but it was a scant collection of debris and a single wheel that offered little clue as to how the plane went down. Some thought it was strange that little else was found, as the sort of sudden explosion that might have caught a crew of experienced airmen unawares would have likely left more evidence. On December 24, 1967, wealthy Miami hotel owner Dan Burrick and Father Patrick Hogan took Burrick's 23-foot craft Witchcraft just off Miami Beach to see the holiday lights. But what was meant to be a quick, fun trip soon turned into an emergency. At around 9 p.m., Burrick contacted the Coast Guard to report the Witchcraft in distress. He claimed that the powerboat had hit an unidentified object and was unable to navigate. He also specified that the Witchcraft was near buoy number 7 in the harbor, theoretically making it easier for help to locate them. But when the Coast Guard arrived 18 minutes later to give the 2 men a ride back to shore, they found only empty water, even though they were just a mile or so off the beach, well within sight of Miami.
Something's wrong. It's almost like something picked it up and took it away. Even
Even stranger, the boat was reportedly designed with flotation gel that made it unsinkable. and would have at worst kept it just below the surface, well within sight of rescuers. Despite a massive search that included 6 planes and 4 U.S. military ships, no sign of either man or their boat was found.
Buoy 7 falls right just barely inside the western tip of the Bermuda Triangle, so a lot of people think the Bermuda Triangle got them.
Where could they have gone in such a short time? Perhaps the boat wasn't as unsinkable as Burrick believed, or maybe one or both of the men got involved with some unsavory characters. And there's yet another possibility.
I think it was a ruse, that he radioed into the Coast Guard and he was never there.
Harry Cohen and Austin Stephanos were last seen on July 24, 2015 when they left Jupiter, Florida in a 19-foot boat. Though both boys were only 14 years old, their families said that Cohen and Stephanos often went fishing and boating. But this time, the pair met bad weather that apparently capsized the boat. The vessel was found about 67 miles north of Daytona Beach, but was pushed out to sea before retrieval. Later, a Norwegian ship came across it, this time about 100 miles from Bermuda. The ship's captain told CBS 12 that the boat was in one piece with a complete hull, a seemingly unaffected engine, and Stephanos' iPhone inside. Other sources reported that the battery and boat ignition were switched off. Cohen's family had apparently set limits on his seafaring activity, and the unauthorized trip had caused a major rift between the families. Testimony from the boys' friends, including communications from that day, indicate that the two realized they were facing bad weather. Some suggested that Cohen and Stephanos were headed to the Bahamas. Other families argue against this, as the two didn't have passports or enough fuel to make the trip. And while Cohen and Stephanos weren't technically inside the commonly accepted bounds of the Bermuda Triangle, it's not entirely clear where they were headed. Their course, intentional or otherwise, may have taken them into the region.